Hi, I'm Rhonda Kohlberg, the Director of the Public Health Department in Door County. I'm going to talk with you today about some of the healthcare practices and illnesses that families had to contend with in the late 1800s and early 1900s. There were many differences between 19th century medicine and our present-day medical knowledge and practices. The 19th century was a period of rapid change in medicine. Developments in science and technology, such as the microscope, as well as changes in government attitudes and the vital discovery of the germ theory, which at last explained the cause of disease, all helped to improve the health of the public. The problems which had held back surgery for so long, such as lack of anesthetics and disinfectants, were also overcome. Women began to break out of the restrictions placed on them by society and take an active part in the medical profession. The foundation of modern medicine was laid, and there were more advances in the 19th century than there had been in the previous 2,000 years. In the late 1880s and early 1900s, influenza and pneumonia were the two leading causes of death. Other infectious disease such as scarlet fever, whooping cough, diphtheria, cholera, and tuberculosis were also responsible for many deaths. Children were at great risk of acquiring these diseases. There were no antibiotics, and there were no vaccines to prevent disease. Antibiotics first came into use in the 1940s, and the first cure for a disease was created in 1894. This was an antitoxin that cured diphtheria. The Pasteur germ theory of disease was not accepted until 1861. Before this, people felt that disease was due to many things, perhaps a punishment for their sins, or poison vapors and miasmas, which were bad smells from the decaying of living materials, or from the unfavorable influence of the heavenly bodies. Even though the germ theory was proven in 1861, it was not immediately accepted, even by the medical professionals of the day. What was called heroic medicine was practiced. As one historian put it, the hero was the patient. The sicker the patient was, the more bleeding was applied, until a patient lost 4/5 of her blood. A poison called lobelia was then administered to the patient to quickly empty her stomach. At the same time, mercury was administered to empty the bowels. The sick were doused with ice water to induce the shakes and covered with hot glass cups to draw out noxious vapors, and incidentally to raise some terrific blisters. Invariably, the people died, and it took many decades before the medical profession lost its onerous bleed, sweat, and purge to death reputation. Other treatments included homeopathic remedies with very small amounts of the substances given. These substances were given in such small quantities that they did no harm and became quite popular as opposed to the medical treatments of the day. The 19th century saw great epidemics of disease. One of these was the diphtheria epidemic of 1861. Wisconsin and Door County felt the ravages of this epidemic. 2,730 children died in Wisconsin, and 12,000 became ill. The mortality rate for diphtheria at that time was anywhere from 35% and up to 90% in cases of diphtheria of the larynx. Children and entire families were quarantined to prevent spreading these infectious diseases. The 1881 Door County Advocate tells many heartbreaking stories about the loss of children to diphtheria. Deaths from infectious diseases declined markedly in the United States during the 20th century. This decline contributed to a sharp drop in infant and child mortality and to a 29-year increase in life expectancy. In 1900, 30% of all deaths occurred among children less than 5 years old. In 1997, that percentage was only 1.4%. With the advent of the germ theory, the government began to take an active role in developing the first effective system of public health since the Romans. New laws in 1848 and 1875 led to great improvements in sanitation, sewage, and water supplies. Medical discoveries and public health campaigns have almost eliminated deaths from the common diseases of childhood, such as measles, mumps, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and whooping cough. As a result of these successes, nearly 29 years were added to the average life expectancy at birth between 1900 and 2000, from 47 years of age to 76 years. In the current 21st century, we are battling many chronic diseases, such as heart disease and cancer, which are the two major causes of death now. We have medical treatments for the most common diseases of the 19th century, but we are being threatened with new diseases, from new bacteria and viruses that are adapting to our current antibiotics and treatments. Foodborne illnesses such as E. coli and bloodborne pathogens such as HIV and hepatitis continue to invade our world. Protecting the health of the public from infectious disease has been a battle that has been fought for many years and by many people, and the struggle will continue. Now let's go and meet some of the people who lived and raised their families during these difficult years.
Guten Tag. Ich komme auf die Schweizer. Oh, excuse me. I forgot. At home we talk German, and here I must speak English. I'm Joe Zettel. I was named Joseph by my father back in Switzerland. I already told you I came from Switzerland. I was born in a small town near Lucerne, the town of Groß-Dietweil. My father was an innkeeper there. He gave me a good education. When I got to be 17, however, my mother died, and father soon remarried, and things at home were not quite that comfortable for me after that. Besides, I loved adventure, so I decided to go to America. I was 19 when I left, and my father paid my way, so I didn't have to go by steerage. I went by train from Lucerne to Belgium, Antwerp, Belgium. I've never been that far from home before. And then by sailboat. It took 53 days to get from Belgium to New York. Oh, was I ever glad to get back on shore again. And I went immediately to Cleveland because I'd heard a lot of German people were living in that area. I worked in Cleveland, first as a farmhand. I made $8 a month, plus my board and room. I liked farming. On the way to get there, I heard some men talking, and it sounded like they were planning to rob me. I was a little uneasy about that. I had all of my worldly possessions with me. Finally, I decided that I would throw my trunk overboard. We were on a boat when this happened. I threw my trunk overboard and I jumped in after it. And I swam to shore, and I pulled the trunk after me. I got to shore and landed in a wooded area and had to carry that trunk. 150 pounds it was. I carried it to safety. It was a great relief to save all of my things. The next year, I got a job with a man in Cleveland. He sent me to Washington Island to help in building lime kilns and to help in building sawmills. So I worked in the northern tip of Door County, and in the winter, I did some logging around Green Bay and over at Oconto and then here in the Sturgeon Bay area. I learned that the land around Sturgeon Bay was really good soil, and I was thinking of saving some money and buying a farm here. So I worked for a lumber man in Sturgeon Bay for a while, and then saved my money and bought a piece of land. It's just north of Sturgeon Bay, north a couple of miles, and then where the wagon track turns to the right toward Institute, you take a right there, and mine is the first farm on the left. It's a good piece of land. It was full of trees, and I began in my spare time to cut the timber and clear the brush. 1862 is a very important year in my memory. 1862, it's the year I met and then married my wife, Christina Lorsch from Nawasapi Township. She was a great partner for me. I brought her home to my farm and we moved into the sugar shack on the land, and that was the beginning for us. She was strong enough to help me clear the trees and work to create a garden and then a field where we grew wheat. And we gradually claimed that land for our use. Sturgeon Bay really wasn't much of a town at the time, so I often walked all the way to Green Bay to buy supplies. And one time Christina walked with me, and we had a picnic all the way. It was one day going and another day to come back, and a day in the city to enjoy the town while we were there. One of the important things about the farm is that I thought the soil would be good for growing fruit trees. And in the same year I got married, I was able to buy some apples and pear trees from George Pinney, who's talking just a little bit over there today. George was selling fruit trees to a number of people in Door County, and my apples really did well. I was so impressed with them that I planted more every year. I tried apricots and plums later, but apples were the best. In fact, I grew so many apples that finally, in 1892, I had an orchard of 77 acres, the largest apple orchard in the state. And we harvested 3,000 bushels of apples that year. My wife sold some on the streets in Sturgeon Bay, and we put some on boats that took them to the cities. It was a great way to spend our time, to work hard, to make a living for us and our family. We had 11 children. I really worked hard to create an apple orchard for each of the 6 boys and gave them each an orchard so that they could continue in this great life here in Door County. While we were living there in Sevastopol town, some of my neighbors got me to be on the township board. And I was the treasurer for a while and then the chair of the township board. And I also was on the school board for a time. Funny thing how they'd let a Democrat like me be in all of those roles in the township and the school. But I enjoyed life there, and Christina and I had a good life together. I went to some of the Wisconsin state fairs early on with my apples, and I met Professor Emmett Goff from Madison, and I met an orchardist from the Richland Center area named Mr. Hatch, Art Hatch, and we became friends, and we began exchanging scientific information about how to grow apples. And the 2 men came to visit me here in Door County. They liked what we were doing here so much, and they liked the soil and the climate, that they began the first cherry orchard here in our county. You know, with the late springtime that we have because of the water all around and because of the limestone in the soil, fruit trees are really good to grow in this place. It was 1893 that I went to the Chicago World's Fair with my apples. I took 20 different kinds. One of them was a Wolf River that measured 14 inches around. And this is a Jersey apple. It's only 12.5 inches. But I won prizes for their beauty, for their taste, and it was fun to do that in Chicago. I also took some apples later to another exhibit in Omaha. It was fun to travel around this country and see more of it. Well, I really liked my life very much, and I was proud of the hard work that created a life for me and my family in this place. But there were three decisions that I made that were especially important for us. One, the first decision was to come to America. The second was to marry Christina. And the third was to plant apple trees.
My name is Agnes Damkohler Long, and I lived in Sturgeon Bay, in the Sturgeon Bay area between 1862 and 1929. In fact, I lie right over there. But I'm not here today to tell you my story. I'm here to tell you the story of my brother, Harry Damkohler. Harry was known throughout Door County and even Wisconsin as a writer, photographer, publisher, historian, museum founder, and curator. But simply listing his accomplishments would not give you insight into this amazing man. You'd have to know his natural curiosity for all of his hobbies, which numbered many. And you'd have to know about the friendship that he felt for the people of Door County, young and old, who by the time of his death knew him simply as their Uncle Harry. The wise, tiny, very old man, dressed formally in a suit, who greeted visitors at the Door County Historical Museum. Harry was born in 1863. He was the baby of our family of 5 children, and he was born under the worst of circumstances. Our parents, Ernst and Matilda Damkohler, were German immigrants. They made their way to Door County in 1857, and they developed a farm and built a modest log cabin on what is now known as County S. But sadly, Harry was never to lay eyes on our father, because before his birth, our father joined the Union Army to defend his new nation in the Civil War. And shortly after when Harry was a baby, in 1864, we got word that our father had been captured by the Confederates, sent to Andersonville Prison, where he died. This left our poor mother with little money and 6 mouths to feed. Harry often told the story that would have been told to him because he wouldn't have remembered this, that the year before our father died in the winter, our mother was forced to burn the cedar fence posts to keep her family from freezing to death. But she did manage to keep everything together until Harry was 7. At that time, he went to the Soldiers' Orphanage in Madison for a short time. He came back here to Sturgeon Bay to live with our mother when he was about 11 years old. She had moved to town by then. Well, Harry was such an industrious boy. He started working at such a young age, only 11 years old, at the jobs that were typical of that day in Door County. He would brag how he could pull 10,000 trees a day at the George Pinney Nursery. He worked sawing and splitting wood at the Latham and Smith Shingle Yard. Harry would have liked to have gone to school more than he did. He had to work when the ice went out of the bay in the spring, all the way until it froze again in the fall. But even though Harry didn't have a lot of formal education, he gained from every situation he was put into. And he was also a great reader. He read Shakespeare and Dickens and Cooper and Dumas and Hugo and Reed and many others, all by the time he was a teenager. And then when he was 16, Harry got the job that set him on his life's path, that of a printer's devil at the Door County Advocate. Now, Harry always wanted to learn a trade, and he was able to become a rapid typesetter. Like everything else Harry did, he wanted to become the best typesetter in the world. And in a way, he accomplished that, because when he was 20, Harry broke the world typesetting record. He set 25,500 M's in 18 3/4 hours. This was a record he was very proud of, and he held it until his dying day. Well, this typesetting record opened many doors for Harry. He actually left the Door County Advocate and left Sturgeon Bay and went on to Milwaukee. And there he started in the newspaper business. He was a typesetter, he was a writer, a reporter, an editor, and even a publisher of newspapers. He was working, this was the day of the weekly newspaper, and Harry worked at the South Milwaukee Star, the Saturday Star, Peck's Sun, which was Governor Peck's newspaper. And he also started working at a daily paper called the Milwaukee Daily Record. Harry met his wife, who was a reporter at Peck's Sun, in 1890, or before 1890. She was also a writer. She shared his love of writing. And they married in 1890. In 1895, they had their only son, their only child, Sylvester. This was a very happy and exciting time for Harry. Sylvester's birth coincided with another one of his many hobbies. He started photography, and it said in our family that Harry wanted to photograph Sylvester every day of his life. I remember Harry with that camera. Every place we went as a family, there was Harry taking pictures. And because of this, your State Historical Society has a wonderful record of family life at the turn of the century, 100 years ago. There's pictures of the Dan Kohler family skating on Sturgeon Bay, gathered around a piano in the parlor, and lounging at a picnic. But not only did Harry like to take pictures of his family, he also began experimenting with photography. He's credited with being one of the first to pose live figures in front of a white sheet, cut the figures out of the picture, and paste them on an artificial background. Harry also began other adventures at this time. Probably because of his young son Sylvester, he started writing stories. And these were stories for young children, primarily boys. And he wrote under the pseudonym Harry D. Stories like James Griffin's Adventure, A Boy's Life on an Island, Sylvester Dant, Dick Dawson's Ambition, and many others. But then in 1907, tragedy struck. Harry's wife fell ill. He decided, in an effort to help her, he moved the family to New Mexico. And unexpectedly, during that same year, his son Sylvester died of complications of diabetes, of course in the day before insulin. And then less than a year later, his wife died in 1908. Broken-hearted, Harry returned to Sturgeon Bay, and at his mother's urging, he bought a piece of land just down the road on Bayshore Drive, known as Sylvan Lodge. And he set out to clear the land for orchard production and to use the building as tourist rooms. Harry continued working at Sylvan Lodge in the summers and working in Milwaukee in the winters with his other writing business and also working as a real estate appraiser. And then in 1925, Harry retired completely, came back to Sturgeon Bay, sold Sylvan Lodge, and set out to fulfill two of his life's dreams. One of them was to write a book on the history of the Ice Age and the history of the Earth. And this is what he did. This is his book here. You can find this in your library system. Harry's second dream was one that would benefit the people of Door County well into the future. He wanted to start a historical museum, and he advocated tirelessly for this end. And finally, in 1935, he convinced the Historical Society to sponsor this project. He was named the building supervisor. He oversaw the Depression-era WPA workers that built the museum. And then, in 1939, Harry was named the museum's first curator. Harry recorded all of the artifacts that were donated by pioneer families, and he displayed them, and he also donated over 1,000 artifacts himself to the museum, and many of these are still on display today. Harry enchanted visitors to the museum. Everybody was taken with his friendly personality and his knowledge of history. In his 1955 annual report to the county board, Harry wrote, "Several bus parties visited the museum. All were entertained, and the members were given prizes of my Ice Age book, Indian arrowheads, and ocean shells." The shells were brought from his vacations in Florida. School children loved Harry. They considered him to be the museum's greatest attraction and its best lesson. In addition to the museum, Harry had so many hobbies that he was well known for. Harry made huge scrapbooks filled with photographs and articles. He sent newsletters to his friends. He would tell his life story and his philosophies and other tidbits and number them and mimeograph them and mail them out to his friends. Harry wrote a county theme song called The Little Door, and he had this published. He brought it to all of the schoolhouses in the county and taught the children the county song. But the sport that Harry loved best was ice skating. I remember Harry as a boy skating on the bay in Sturgeon Bay. But I bet some of you remember Harry skating at Market Square as a very old man, dressed in his suit. Harry didn't only love ice skating, he considered it downright medicinal. One time he had a flu and people told him he should go to the hospital. But this is what he did instead. I donned my skates and skated like mad around the school rink until I had worked up a perspiration, and then drank several glasses of hot lemonade and, wrapping myself in a blanket, went to bed. Next morning, I was like a new person. Harry will always be remembered for constructing the centerpiece to the museum, the stone fireplace. He solicited 91 stones from around the country. He meticulously kept track of where the stones came from and who donated them. He laid the stones, he added the mantle, and then he carved his motto in the mantle: "The past, the present, and the future cannot be separated." To Harry, this was a symbol of the county's rich history and the unity of its people. But it's also a testament to this remarkable man that was my brother, Harry Dan Kohler. Harry died in 1955 at the age of 92.
Well, thank you folks for coming this afternoon. I appreciate your interest in historical things, and particularly the Historical Society, and especially our family, the Basford family. I've been resurrected for a day. The Lord gave me leave here for a little bit of time to talk to you good friends, so forth. And obviously, I've been planted here many years ago, back in 1902. So I guess I'm a little bit tired and saying I'm 172 years old right now. But I guess I can still stand up here and address you folks. One of the biggest evidences that I lived in Door County was the fact that I, of course, planted here, but the other evidence that I like very much was the original home that we built in 1858, which is situated out on the place called the Farm. It's a thriving little enterprise out on Highway 57 on the way to Bailey's Harbor. And if you ever go out there, you should go in there. It'll cost you a few dollars, of course, to get in there. But to see the original log home that I constructed back in 1858 for my family. But anyway, the other evidence, if you ever travel north on the way to Egg Harbor, you will see the piece of land that I homesteaded. I'll have a little more to say about that in a few moments. I built what I considered quite a palatial home back there, a 13-room home with about 5-6 bedrooms because we had 9 children. And anyway, that farm home is still existing. I'm sorry that it's in rather dilapidated condition now. The other thing, right behind it, there was a long, narrow building. It was painted in red paint, beautiful building. And we called it the Halfway House. Many people were traveling and coming through Door County at times, just as they are today, but not, of course, the volume we have today. But from Green Bay to Gills Rock, the Sturgeon Bay area is about halfway. So we would let the people stay there for nothing. They didn't have to pay anything to stay in our halfway house, but they had to provide for their own food. So we did charge them for food. We weren't in a money-making enterprise at that time, so forth. So, and then the thing I think that stands out a great deal of mine, we're in the town of Sebastopol here. That's an unusual name. the reason that Sevastopol was called Sevastopol, I happened to be a buff of the Crimean War, and it was a big battle fought down in the Crimean Peninsula, which is that little piece of land that juts down into the Black Sea. And there is a town there located on that peninsula called Sebastopol with a B. Anyway, I liked that name, and so the men didn't like the B, so they changed it to V, and so it became Sevastopol. In that farm, in that little original farm home, that little log home that we had there, is where we adopted that name Sevastopol. So if you're ever out there, think about it. George Batsford's name is on there. George Batsford family, the original log home. I was born, of course, at a very tender age over in Nottinghamshire, England. You know, the British, they like to be terribly British, and they don't call a county like we call a county here. They call it a shire. They like that name a little bit. It's about 100 miles north of London, about in the middle of England. I didn't have much formal education. I think at that time, of course, when I was a young man, just getting started, Queen Victoria became the British queen at that time. 1830, she ruled in 1837 to 1901, the British Empire, great time of peace. And so but she just didn't get that started right away, the schools, although she was instrumental a little later on in getting the school started. But anyway, I had a lot of good schooling in the Episcopalian or Church of England, Anglican Church Sunday School. I learned the 3 R's there, and so I was not a complete dunce when it came to learning things and so forth. My dad said, go out and get yourself a job, George, and so I did. I went in the railroad business, and I became an expert at round table construction. You know, all know what a round table in the old days, that's how you turn locomotives around. I became an expert at that and so forth. And I fell in love about that time with a very lovely young lady who was also buried over here, Sarah Seaton. I met Sarah as a young man, and we fell in love, and were married in the year of 1850. Wasn't too long after that we had son Billy, so forth. Billy came to Sturgeon Bay, of course, with us, and later on, so forth, and lived in the lumber business years ago. Okay, we, as I told you, we had kind of the wanderlust, and we decided, since a lot of people were going over to America, we decided we'd like to come to America too. We went over to Liverpool and booked passage on a sailing vessel, and just think of this, it took us 6 weeks, 42 days to cross the Atlantic. And you'll never believe this, but I'm telling you the truth. It cost $17 for the passage for 3 of us, for my wife, Sarah, myself, and little Billy. Just think of that. However, we had to provide our own food, and we ate a lot of bread and cheese and things like that. We could purchase some on the ship, of course, but it was $17 fee. We landed in New York, lived in Brooklyn, and I secured a job. I had to get a job and support my family, and I got a job up in Albany, New York, and in railroad construction there. But that kind of petered out and so forth. And I knew there was a lot of construction going on over in Ontario. And Sarah and Billy and I moved over to Hamilton and got a job with the Grand Trunk Railroad, and I stayed there 3.5 years. And you might be interested to know that the man who hired me didn't get along too well with the 1,500-man crew, and I supplanted him, and I was boss over those 1,500 men. We got along handsomely. However, Sarah and I weren't really too happy with the situation in Canada because there were Indians roaming around there, and there were a lot of unrest and so forth. We decided to go back to the U.S., and we finally wound up out in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, at the foot of Lake Winnebago and so forth. And I still had the wanderlust. I wanted to look around and so forth and see if I couldn't find a place to settle down. And after about 6 days of walking around the state, we wound up in beautiful Door County. And I fell in love with a particular patch of land out in the piece of land out in what is now, of course, Sebastopol town. And I had saved enough money up by that time to purchase land. You won't believe this. $1.25 an acre is all we paid for that land, just for 204. And I subsequently bought another 80, so we had 320 acres of land, the largest holding in that particular town. But anyway, it's one of the saddest things that happened in my life at that time. After we had, of course, John and Eliza, besides Billy, is Sarah here, and I almost weep to think about it. She died at 28 years of age. Just think to lose her. However, it wasn't too long as typical man looking for another wife. I was pretty young yet and so forth. And I met a lovely young woman by the name of Elida Johanna Ressing. She was a native of Prussia, had come over with her father, emigrated to America and so forth. And I married her. and she accepted my proposal and so forth. And that's when we built that first dwelling, as I told you about, back in 1856. I also built that large home residence in about 1870, when it's still on the foundation out there. Our family began to grow. My eyes aren't so good anymore after 172 years, so I have to read this to you. The family we had with George Jr., he died, and he's on this planet at 29 years of age. All my other children lived quite a while. Henry, Charlie, Emma, Amelia, and Augusta. I shouldn't say they all did, because Charlie is buried over there. He died. I'll have something to say about that in a moment. At 39 years of age, that was a sad one. I also owned between 500 and 1,000 acres of land, not for farming purposes, but for logging. We logged, of course, the peninsula was full of trees at that time. We logged off the larger trees and so forth, and made them lumber out of them, as well as shingles to sell down in the Chicago and Milwaukee market. I became the postmaster for the area, and also one of the most exciting things I had, we owned 2/3 interest in the ferry boat that went across the bay here in Sturgeon Bay. Of course, there wasn't any bridge at that time. That wasn't built till way back up in the 80s and so forth. I operated a cheese factory on the southwest corner of the farm. Another thing I enjoyed doing every spring was making maple syrup and maple sugar. We made about 1,500 pounds of maple sugar every year. So the sons and I, we had a large evaporator there, and that existed up until just a few years ago. Another sad affair was that when I said my son Charles died in 1902, we both contracted pneumonia. Charlie died on January 22nd, and as I remember, January 25th. We were both buried in a joint funeral we had down here, a common funeral. We were both buried. I'm right over here, and Charles is buried over there. And I just want to talk a little bit about my legacy. I don't like to toot my horn and so forth, but I believe that God gave me a great deal of energy and vitality with diligent work habits. That's what characterized my life. To summarize my life, I have to refer to all these things I did, kind of a jack of all trades. A pioneer landowner, businessman, lumberman, cheesemaker, dairy farmer, financier. I did have quite a bit of money and helped people and use it to for good purposes. Ferry boat owner, the local politician. I held all town offices except Justice of the Peace and Postman. I don't think I was a dog catcher, but I held a lot of other ones. Yeah. Now this is something I didn't say. This is what a Chicago paper said about me. People have said about George that my good reputation was attributed to a pioneering and fearless spirit who was unafraid in venturing into unknown circumstances, providing success in each enterprise I was involved in. At the same time, I exhibited a great deal of honesty and integrity. He followed biblical principles, and thus led by his Heavenly Father, he honored him by and with his life. And I might add to this, I helped build an Episcopalian or Anglican church here in Sturgeon. It burned down a little later on, not my fault. But anyway, it burned down, and they attended worship services there regularly after they rebuilt it, and had a profound effect on me and on my entire family. I wanted to just close with this saying I was named Gov, G-O-V. It was kind of humorous, little name that they tacked onto me because of the numerous positions I held in the town here and the influence I had in the political scene. And I don't want to offend any of you good Democrats here, but I was a staunch Republican all of my days. Thank you, folks, for coming. I appreciate it. Now I'll go take my leave and go back to my grave for a while.
As most people go through life, they will have a variety of jobs, but my case is quite different. It is as though I were born to be a medical doctor, and my real claim to fame is that I served as a family practice doctor here in Sturgeon Bay in Door County for 55 years. And this is a picture of me, a fairly recent one. And my name is Dr. Frederick Huff. And from the left-hand corner of the tombstone, you could see that I was born in 1877 in Orchard, Nebraska, to Mr. and Mrs. Silas Huff. After I graduated from high school, I moved to South Dakota and there was a teacher. And soon I was accepted into medical school at Northwestern University. Then in 1902, There were two critical experiences for me. I was age 25, and I married my wife, Wonia, and we were married for a period of 50 years prior to her death. And also, in 1902, at age 25, I moved to Sturgeon Bay to begin my career as a medical doctor. And these were the days in which all doctors were expected to make house calls. So all my patients had not only my office phone number, but my home phone number. And I was willing to go out anytime, day or night, in any kind of weather if there was some kind of an emergency. And if, for instance, a baby was to be born, I often would take a nurse or someone else with me to help. In 1934, Mayor Stanley Green appointed me as the city physician. It's a position I held for the next 21 years. And during that time, I suppose I gave as many, if not more, inoculations than any other doctor in the area. Whatever the particular disease that was sweeping through a community, from smallpox to polio, I was there to give those vaccinations to school children. And I guess the particular experience that left an impression on a good many of these children was the fact that in my latter years I had a little tremor, and as I would be about to give that shot, I would suddenly steady myself and then drive the needle home. But maybe the shot for which I am best remembered occurred after the Second World War, when that wonderful antibiotic, penicillin, came into common usage. It would get rid of all kinds of infections, even life-threatening infections. And what I would always do would be to ask my patient to get up on the table, stomach down, toes together, heels apart, and to relax their glutamus maximus, and then I would give them that penicillin shot. And most of them reported that they thought it was a little less painful being relaxed and in that position. I did all kinds of procedures in the field of medicine during those years. But I also was very much enamored with the community of which I was a part and tried to be a good citizen. When the West Side School was built, I served as a member of the school board. I was a member of Hope Congregational Church and served as a trustee. For 50 years, I was a member of the Henry S. Baird Masonic Lodge and served as one of its past masters. In 1923, I founded the Sturgeon Bay Savings and Loan, and then from 1925 to 1956 was the president of the Sturgeon Bay Building and Loan. In 1914, something occurred which was upsetting to our nation. Relations with Mexico had not been good, and a man named Francisco Villa and his men crossed the border into New Mexico, and in the city of Columbus went on a raiding party, killing 8 Americans. And it was the excuse that our president was looking for to send United States Army troops into Mexico and once and for all find that bandit. And I was a part of that group. Now, there are some historians today who claim that that was just a prelude, or almost as though we were practicing for military preparedness to go into World War I. In 1917, I was made a captain, and a year later a major, and was sent to France. And there I served as the head of field hospitals for the 89th Division. And this is the bag that I took with me. It holds my personal belongings, clothing, some medical instruments. Now that World War I was to be the war to end all wars. It was an experience that no one could ever forget. For during those years, 10 million men died on the battlefields of Europe. Another 20 million eventually died from disease, hunger, and war-related causes. 6 million were left permanently crippled. I returned home, but no one could ever remain the same after that experience. When World War II broke out, I was appointed as the chief examiner for the Selective Service in Sturgeon Bay, as well as the head of Civil Defense. In 1958, the Wisconsin State Medical Society honored me for being a doctor in our state for 50 years. Truly, it was an honor. And then at the age of 80, and after serving now as a doctor for 55 years, my health was beginning to fail. My eyesight was not so good anymore, and I decided it was about time to retire. Lived another 2 years, died at the age of 82, and hopefully remembered by Sturgeon Bay as a highly respected physician and one who loved both his community and his country.
Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you much for coming to what I call my eternal resting spot, right here in the ground in Sturgeon Bay. For those of you who don't know who I am Joseph Harris, Jr., and I am wearing the uniform of the United States Lighthouse Service. Now, this is a heavy wool uniform, and if you don't mind, I'd like to take my jacket off so I'm a little cooler than I am right now. Any complaints? Thank you. I was born in England in 1841, and at age 8, my family and I immigrated to the United States, and we moved to Rochester, New York. We lived in Rochester for 5 years before my father moved us to Sturgeon Bay. And when we got to Sturgeon Bay, my father had a dream, Joseph Harris Sr., and his dream was to connect the waters of Sturgeon Bay and Lake Michigan together. And he worked tirelessly for 20 years trying to do that. Now, one of the things he wanted to do when he was doing that was to get rich. So he bought a lot of land along the original route. Unfortunately, the original route went right through solid rock. So the engineers moved it about a quarter of a mile south through the sandy area, and the land that my father owned didn't amount to very much, so we didn't make any money on that project. But he did continue to work, and in 1879, the first real ship sailed through that canal heading for Chicago. The ship was a schooner. It was a schooner America, appropriately named, and she was loaded with lumber, going to Chicago to help rebuild the Chicago buildings after the Great Fire. Now, enough about my father. He was here last year, and I know that he told a few stories that he probably shouldn't have told, but I'd like to tell you a little bit more about my life. Civil War came along, and I was a very patriotic man. So I joined the 12th Wisconsin Infantry Division and went off to war to fight for the Union. And I fought honorably until I was wounded in the wrist in Petersburg, Virginia. Now, at that point, I could have come home, but I chose not to do that. I allowed my wrist to heal, and I re-enlisted into Company K of the 36th Wisconsin Infantry and fought on until I was finally honorably discharged as a captain in 1864. And in fact, you'll see back here two gravestones. This one's my family stone, and right behind it there's another one. It says Company K on it with my name, and it says I was a lieutenant. And I'm not sure how the history books and the gravestone don't coordinate with each other, but I was a captain when I got out in 1864. Now, 1864 was a good year. I married Rosalie that year. Rosalie was also from New York State, and she and her family moved to Raleigh's Bay, Wisconsin, and then they finally went to Rock Island. And in fact, Rosalie became the first school teacher on Rock Island. And do you know she was only 16 years old right then? 16 years old and was teaching school. She was a remarkable woman. Lived long after I died, and was just a terrific person. Now, in 1875, I became the lighthouse keeper at Bailey's Harbor. And there were some people that said that it was nepotism. And I can tell you right now that that was not true at all. My father was in Washington, D.C., working for Senator Sawyer. But my job appointment had nothing to do with him. My job appointment had to do with the fact that I had fought hard in that Civil War, and I was rewarded for that with that position, as were many other men that came back from the war. Now, Bailey's Harbor was a good position to have. It wasn't like a lot of lighthouses, way out in the middle of nowhere with no friends or people around. We lived close enough to town that our children actually went to school in Bailey's Harbor. We walked to town to get our groceries, and we met friends and had them into our house often. In fact, I started the Bailey's Harbor Literary Society, and that was a debating society. I can remember a couple of the debates that we had. We had one good one about whether or not the country should promote immigration to help popularize the country. And then there was a wild one. We had a debate about whether we should have capital punishment or life imprisonment for criminals. That was a wild night. Now, just before we left Bailey's Harbor, there was something called the Alpena Blow. And there were 100 lives lost that night on the Great Lakes. The winds changed and came up fierce winds. We had 9 ships go aground in Bailey's Harbor alone. One of them actually ended up breaking up and coming ashore. 9 ships. We didn't lose any lives, but all I could do was stand on shore and watch. It was a bad, bad night. Well, in 1880, the Lighthouse Service found it appropriate to transfer me, and they sent me off to Green Island. And I told you about that desolation that some of the lighthouse keepers had. Well, Green Island was the worst of them. Out in the middle of Green Bay someplace with nothing around. Nobody there. Once in a while, we'd see the Lighthouse Service when they brought supplies, but it was not a good position for us. I let the Lighthouse Service know that I was not at all happy. And it took about a year. I got transferred from Green Island to Evanston, Illinois, to the Grosse Pointe Lighthouse. And that again was a good position. It was close to people, and we had friends, but we yearned to come back to Sturgeon Bay. And in 1885, I heard that there was going to be a position opening in Sturgeon Bay at the Dunlap Reef. And you may have seen the reef if you were driving across that Michigan Street Bridge, I think they call it now. But there's a little spit of land out there in the middle of the bay. One point there was a lighthouse out there, a range light similar to Bailey's Harbor, with the big house in the back and the range light up forward, about 700 feet in between them. We didn't live in the lighthouse. We lived on shore most of the time. I'd go out and spend a few days when it was bad weather. But we lived on shore in my father's house, and I had to row from the main building up to the forward light to keep that light burning. And the boats that the Lighthouse Service provided for us, oh boy, they were bad. So I decided I would correct that situation, and I started my own boat works in the blacksmith shop right next door to my father's house, the Harris Boat Works. And I built some pulling boats, gave one to a friend out in Cana Island, and he thought it was a fine, magnificent boat and told me about it. I, of course, thought it was a good boat, and I had one myself. The best thing that happened was the inspector came one day, and he looked at those boats, and he said, "These are great. Where did you get them?" And I told him, and he ordered 40 more for other lighthouses around the Great Lakes, and I was very proud of that. Well, the boat works stayed in operation from 1885 until 1911. That was the first commercial boat works in Sturgeon Bay, the first of many boat works that were in Sturgeon Bay, and I think there are probably still a couple that are going on now that are building fine ships. Well, we built power boats, we built sailboats, pulling boats, catboats, and did fine work for many, many people in the area. Now, in 1890, I heard that there was a position of being the postmaster that was going to open up in Sturgeon Bay. So a couple of my friends suggested I apply for that job, and I thought it would be a good position to have. Now, I didn't want to necessarily leave the Corps, but postmaster got an awful lot of money. So I decided I would give it a try, and I put my application into Washington. It was a presidential appointment. And I got that presidential appointment and took on the job as postmaster. Well, unfortunately, President Harrison lost re-election. And when he went out of office, my job disappeared. Someone else took on the postmaster job. So I kept going with my boat works. In 1901, I became the mayor for the first time. I ran twice, 1901 and 1902, and won both times. I was pretty proud of that. Was the mayor here in Sturgeon Bay. After I was the mayor, I was justice of the peace for a while, until my health began to fail. So I decided it would be good for me to go to Florida to see if I could revive myself, and I went to Florida on my own, to St. Cloud, Florida. Unfortunately, I didn't revive, and I ended up at the hospital, the Veterans Hospital in Tennessee. And after some communications problems back and forth, it was March 23rd, I believe, in 1916, I died. Rosalie was finally notified here in Sturgeon Bay. She came to Tennessee to pick up my remains. And she brought them back here to the plot, the Rice family plot, so that when she died, many years later, she'd be able to be buried next to me. Now, the Rice family was an honorable family to be with. Mr. Rice became a judge here in town, so they were very well known here in Sturgeon Bay. Now, I hope the Historical Society will someday invite Rosalie back, because she has a story all of herself, and she has a great story. So I'd suggest that to you. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them, or I'd suggest that you might take a trip across that bridge we talked about. And there's a fine museum over there, I'm told, that will tell you the history of the maritime history of Sturgeon Bay and Door County. Thank you. Now, I was a patriotic, so I joined. Enlisted in the 12th Constitution went off to war.
I'm George Pinney, and I'm happy to be here today with you, telling you a little bit about who I am. Well, I was born in Paynesville, Ohio, and one interesting thing was that when I was going to Hiram College, I had the pleasure of actually being with a person who became President McKinley. So that was interesting. But I've always had kind of a problem. I'm not a big sort of a fella, and a little bit had a few health problems and so on, and eventually I decided to move out of Ohio and move to De Pere in Wisconsin. Wouldn't you know that when I was there, I was involved in a mill accident, flax company that I worked for, a mill, and so I'm even more of a problem with my handicaps. And so when I came to Sturgeon Bay, I was looking for something to do that I could in Door County to wouldn't be so physical in nature. So I started out by working for Door County itself, and I audited the books, and I drew some maps, and I tried the grocery business, and I even was a pretty good preacher at the Methodist Church as a circuit rider. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, because I did lose my job because of some other interests there. But as I was going up and down the county, I noticed that all these beautiful evergreens, and we can see them here today around us. And I remembered that in the cities that they didn't have these plants to enjoy. So I decided that, well, maybe I could just ship some of those out to people in the cities. And so I started this business, a nursery business in 1864, gathering these plants. And as this business flourished, I had some helpers. They called them the Penny Swamp Angels, and they'd go out and collect these plants out in the woods and bring them to me, and I'd pay them 15 cents a thousand, and they could earn about 50 cents a day, and then I had to ship them on these boats. There was only 2 boats in those days. You know, it was terrible in those days. We had 2 Goodrich boats a week that came in, and they have to go all the way around the county and out Death Door, and then finally to Chicago. And you know how I feel about getting that canal here. That's important to us because we can cut off several days into Chicago, and I can get my seedlings down there a lot sooner. Well, anyway, as the business started to flourish, sometimes these boats would come in, and they would be on Sunday. You know, they didn't care what day of the week they came, whatever the winds were. So the whistle would blow, and I'd go out of the step down in the middle of the service and the sermon, and I'd go down and load the boats. Well, Methodist Church didn't like that too well, so eventually we parted company. They didn't pay me real well either, I don't think, but and anyway, the business started to flourish, and I needed a partner, and the partner, his name was Weed, and so Mr. Weed and I were in business together for a couple of years. Well, not quite a couple of years. Then I needed more capital, so I sought the help of A.W. Lawrence Sr., who was a big timber baron here, and he helped out quite a bit with the finances and so forth. And as the business flourished, then I also needed a secretary, because all these books were sold. They were all handwritten. They were just, that was a terrible job. So I wrote to Spencerian College, and I told them, you know, I'd like a secretary that could take shorthand. You know, it's got to be fast, because I could talk pretty fast. Secondly, we needed somebody who could run this newfangled thing you do with your, I guess it's a typewriter. And then finally, you know, I was pretty staunch about this. It had to be a Protestant, could not be a Catholic. So the first lady that came, they shipped up a Catholic, and I turned her right around and sent her back. And then finally they sent up the Protestant lady, and I think that was kind of a smart move on my part, at least when she came up here, because as the business flourished, then you know how these things happen. Then she fell in love with my son, and they got married, and that was good, because I think she's a pretty smart lady, and you'll see how that's kind of important a little later on. So anyway, there was I got involved in the reform things going on, and I even got shot at downtown here by some judge that didn't like what I thought about Lincoln and so on. And so I decided I'm going to get out of town. I can't fight because I'm too small a guy. So I moved out to Evergreen, what's now Evergreen. We had a post office there. Well, actually we shipped more than in the city of Sturgeon Bay, with blacksmith shop, little floor shop, and all kinds of buildings. And so out of there we built quite a business, and we were once we educated our customers how to grow these wonderful evergreens, everything flourished. Everything was great. And then, unfortunately, in 1893, I discovered that I had stomach cancer, and but you know, the world's got to go on. We got to do our thing. So I got the family together, and I said to them, you know, we're going to have to take this business. We want to continue. It's been good to us. So you're all going to have to participate in this. And we'll, instead of calling it had gone through Penny and Weed and Penny and Lawrence and just the Penny Nursery, now it's going to become Evergreen Nursery Company. The family now, is going to have to make this go. And you know what? I think that this lady, it was really kind of wonderful, my daughter-in-law, because my son is good, but he's more interested in the publishing business. And these old Democrats here that he's got here published, but he's not so interested in the nursery business. But this lady, I think, will carry this thing on, and I'm sure she will. So.
Leroy Marshman Washburn was born February 12th in Foxcroft, Maine, to William and Lucy Washburn in the year 1847. He grew up on his father's farm, was educated in the Foxcroft Academy, and started out as a teacher. He met Jonathan Lawrence, also a teacher, who was visiting Maine, and they became friends through their conversation. Jonathan convinced Grandpa to come to Door County for a visit. Grandpa had bought a farm and was going into the farming business, but he was so interested from his talks with Jonathan that he decided to go to Sturgeon Bay. The trip was made by train to Grand Haven, Michigan, and from there via boat to Horns Pier in Door County, which was a shipping port for lumber. Upon arrival at Horns Pier, the routes to Sturgeon Bay were by muddy roads or by boat around the top of the county. Grandpa and several other passengers decided to walk the 8 miles over the roads to Sturgeon Bay. Grandpa met Jonathan Lawrence at Sturgeon Bay and was given a job at the A.W. Lawrence store as a clerk. The Lawrence store was located on the corner where the Pudgy Seagull now has its restaurant. The business was conducted as A.W. Lawrence, by A.W. Lawrence, C.M. Chase, and his father. A year later, Grandpa sold his farm in Maine and purchased the Chase interest in the store. The business was continued on the corner until 1880, when a new 2-story building was erected diagonally across the street. Soon after this, Grandpa Washburn purchased the A.W. Lawrence interest and conducted the store as the L.M. Washburn Company. He also bought out the Don Rice store on the east side of the bay in 1879. And this business also was conducted there as the L.M. Washburn Company. The store was later resold, and the store on the east side of the bay was the only one now known as the L.M. Washburn Company. The store was operated for 50 years. The H.C. Prangy Washburn purchased the L.M. Washburn Company, and the name was changed to the Prangy Washburn Company, and operated under this name until a fire destroyed the building in 1930. At this time, the store was rebuilt and was renamed the H.C. Prangy Company. L.M. Washburn also had interest in several other businesses, including a flour mill, a lumber yard, and a planing mill. He was also a director of the Anape and Western Railroad and an executive of the Merchants Exchange Bank. The lumber yard was a joint venture with his brother Newell S. Washburn, but he became sole owner after his brother's death. The business was later sold and the Barker Washburn Company evolved, until such time as it was sold out completely and became the Barker Lumber and Fuel Company. Twice, Grandpa tossed his hat in the ring as a candidate for the Assembly in 1875 and 1876, and again when he served a time for the school board. The government had turned over to the Canal Company 400,000 acres of prime lands in Door County, Kewaunee County, Brown County, Oquendo County, and Marinette County, in return for the construction of the Sturgeon Bay and the Lake Michigan Ship Canal. They were rapidly converting the timber into lumber, but were doing nothing about digging the canal. Grandpa Washburn's working in the State Assembly secured the desired results, and the canal construction began. L.M. Washburn was married November 14, 1875, to Miss Ruth Emily Lawrence, a daughter of A.W. Lawrence. There were 3 children, George H. Washburn, Emily R. Washburn, and Harold E. Washburn. Emily was married to Willard E. Gady and had 1 son, Leroy Lewis Gady. George Washburn married Jenny Reisdorf and had 4 children, Genevieve Washburn, Harold Washburn, Jane Washburn, and Lawrence M. Washburn. The only survivors are Leroy Gady and myself, Lawrence M. Washburn. Grandpa Washburn died at the age of 72 on April 7th in 1939 from old age and infirmities. The funeral rites were conducted by the Reverend Jane M. Burren at home at 1:30 and at the Congregational Church at 2 p.m. He was buried at the Bayview Cemetery. The L.M. Washburn's home was on the north side of Louisiana Street and 2nd Avenue. The Gady home was next door, going north, and the L.M. Washburn home was on the next corner. Newell S. Washburn lived on the corner across the street from LMA.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Augusta Schofield. Have you seen my house out on Michigan Street? It's a beauty, isn't it? In 1902, Bert and I and the boys moved in. Until then, we had been living at 4th and Kentucky Streets, right downtown. So it was quite a change moving out to the edge of town. But I need to backtrack. You know, I am not a native of Sturgeon Bay. I was born in Watertown, Wisconsin in 1855. My father was a Moravian pastor, and we moved several times while I was growing up. Thank goodness my father was in favor of education for women. When I was 15, I attended the Moravian College in southern Indiana. After that, I taught briefly in Wisconsin, and then I returned to the college and joined the faculty. Now, meanwhile, my sister was living in Sturgeon Bay. Her husband was Reverend Madsen, pastor of the Moravian Church here. In 1875, she was expecting her first child, so I left the college and came to Sturgeon Bay to help her out. Now, in Sturgeon Bay, the Moravians were Norwegians, and I was used to Germans, so that took some getting used to. Nevertheless, I stayed on, and I taught for 2 years at Big Creek School, and then at the village school, and there I became vice principal. In 1881, a severe diphtheria epidemic swept through the village. I stopped teaching to care for one of my students, but alas, she died, and I came down with a light case of diphtheria, but I recovered to resume teaching. Soon, though, I made a change. I began working at the A.W. Lawrence General Store. Also working there in the hardware department was Bert Schofield. Now Bert, who was Herbert C. Schofield formerly, and his family had come to Sturgeon Bay in 1880. His father, Charles, had been in the lumber business in several towns, and he started a lumber yard in Sturgeon Bay. Charles became Sturgeon Bay's first mayor in 1883. Also in 1883, I married tall and handsome Bert, and I was 28 years old. When the Lawrence store was reorganized and became the Washburn store, the hardware department was eliminated. So Bert and his brother-in-law started their own hardware business. Soon, though, Bert's brother Harry bought out the brother-in-law, and the Schofield Hardware Company was born. It prospered and became Sturgeon Bay's largest hardware business and even the second largest in the state. Well, I was as much interested in the business as my husband, and I traveled to many state and national conventions. For 5 years, Bert was the Wisconsin delegate to the National Hardware Association convention. One of those years, he could not go, so I took his place, traveling on the train alone to New Haven, Connecticut. Both before and after my marriage, I loved to travel. I made trips to the far west and down south and to the East Coast. And in 1928, my friend Ivy Latham Walsh and I went to Europe. But again, I need to backtrack. 2 years after our marriage, our son Harry was born, followed by 3 more boys. Then tragedy struck, as it did so many in those days, when our second son, Howard, died when he was 12 years old. The others grew to adulthood. Harry married and moved south, founding the Schofield Auto Music Company. Stanley was a graduate of the Chicago Art Institute, and he lived in New York City and was a commercial artist and designer. Later, he moved back to live in Sturgeon Bay. Lloyd went into the iron ore business and lived with his wife and child in Ironwood, Michigan. Well, Bert was much involved in politics. He served 6 terms as alderman and 2 terms as mayor. Plus, he was active in Rotary, in Masons. He was the first president of the Chamber of Commerce. He was an avid, photographer and sportsman. So with all this activity, our home on Michigan Street was the setting for a very active social life over the years. When I was 79 years old, I traveled on my own to North Carolina to visit our son Harry and his wife. While there, I developed gallbladder trouble. Taken to the hospital in Asheville, I died in June of 1935. Bert lived on in our home on Michigan Street until 1952, when he died at the age of 92. And this is our resting place right here.
Hello, I'm Latham Smith, and I think I'll start with how I died. I was an avid sailor here in Sturgeon Bay. I purchased a boat from Franklin Roosevelt, and it was about a 28-foot sailboat. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt had a wheelchair, so in the companionway, he had butcher boards in there to keep the sea out when you close the hatch on the boat. And I had done my race on Saturday and decided to bring the boat back on Sunday. So I took my daughter, Patsy, her roommate from college, and 2 of my business partners to sail back to Sturgeon Bay. Well, we got back about 15 miles this way, and all of a sudden a big squall storm came up. And the first wave and wind started to make us broach. Well, the boat went over, and all we had was the jib up, and the boat came back, and the second wave came over the whole boat, filled the cockpit, went right through the area where you'd go below, and the whole boat filled up with water. Of course, I wasn't the best of swimmers, so I went down with the boat. My 2 business partners did not have a life jacket. They went down, and before I went down, I told my daughter, I said, you and your roommate, you swim to shore with this 1 life jacket. Well, she swam to shore, and her roommate, who had diabetes, was very weak, and she panicked, and she went down. So the only survivor of my family was Patsy. Susan was not along, but she just died here about 2 years ago. This was the recovery of the half moon, and the divers went down and they raised it, and you could see here where the main sail was still on the boat, and the jib was the only sail, and I evidently was told I was caught up in the rigging when I went down. So that's the end of my story. Now let's go back to my beginning. I was born in 1886. My father was Thomas Smith, and my dad had a partner called his last name was Latham. I forgot his first name. But anyway, he thought so much of his partner that when I was born, he called me Latham Smith. Well, between the two of us, we were both workaholics in the area. My dad had lumber yards and coal companies and all kinds of docking things and so forth. And we had the quarry out here, out at the end of Bayshore, and we quarried all that limestone for the railroads that were going in Wisconsin and Illinois and all around the Lake Michigan. So there was a big demand for quarried stone. And I also invented a ship that would carry that stone and had self-unloaders. That was also patented by me. I went, as a very young man, I noticed a property over by, it was the Nelson Farm, over where the new bridge is now. But that property, I said, I would love to have that property right by the bay. I think I could make money with that property someday. He was like a 14-year-old kid working on the farm. And today it is Latham Smith Lodge. And he had bought it, and he tried to make a yacht club out of it. And he was an avid golfer and, of course, a hunter. And he decided to build this lodge. And he had a little golf course there, and he had he wanted to make a bar out of it, really, for the yacht club. And at one time he lost it, and a group of people got it, and they called it the Commodore's Club. Well, the company, Latham Smith Company, then bought it back and developed it back into the Latham Smith Lodge. Some of the achievements that Latham Smith shipyards did in the 40s, they had 750 women working here in Sturgeon Bay. Some were welders. You've heard the term Rosie the Riveter. That was kind of coined from here. All those ships, over 100 different kinds of ships, were built here, and they got many awards from the government. And the E Award, of course, was the Excellent Award. And all those ships during the war, if you got the Excellent Award, that was a very high thing to behold. And after the ship building for the war ended, then he got into the ship container, which he invented, and did a real good business with that. And Latham Smith's name in the area is he's done more for the county, I think, than any other man in the history of this county. And I think if I could have been around, I would have liked to have known myself. Thank you.
Hi, I'm glad you all could come because I've been so wanting to tell you about my life. My name is Matilda Graham Miner. You see my tombstone is right here. It says Tilly Miner. Hardly anybody even knew that my name was Matilda. Everybody knew me as Tilly Miner. My father was Oliver Perry Graham, and he came from out east in Ohio, and he came here in the early 40s, the 1840s now I'm talking about, and he saw great potential in this peninsula. He saw that there were fish to be caught, he saw there were forests to be harvested, and so after he married my mother, Mary Ann Marshall, in 1847, they moved to Rock Island. Rock Island, you're saying? No one lives on Rock Island. Ah, but they did then. There was a wonderful little fishing village there. And my parents lived there, and they loved it. Now, my mother didn't love it quite enough to have me there. Once she realized that she was pregnant, she made arrangements to go back and stay with her mother. And I was born actually in Brown County. But believe me, I'm a Door County native in spirit. Now, in 1848 was when I was born. Does that date ring a bell with you? It should. It's the year Wisconsin became a state, and so Wisconsin and we got our start the same year. My father decided in 1850, when I was 2 years old, that he had itchy feet, and he was going to move us again. He moved us to Sturgeon Bay because he had seen that there was a great strand of timber there.
and he bought what is now pretty much downtown Sturgeon Bay. And he built us a house, a little house overlooking the water. It was a nice little house. And he ran a sawmill, and he logged off pretty much all of the timber. The house, of course, is gone, but there's a plaque there showing where the house once was. Do you know where it is? It's where the Peterson Pool now stands. Right next to the Peterson Pool, there's a rock with a plaque placed there by the Historical Society. And that was where I grew up. Now, when I was 13, my father again got itchy feet. It was 1861. He had already done the fishing and the logging, so now he was going to try his hand at farming in Egg Harbor, and we moved up there. Now, this was the point where I first met Edward Sloan Miner. I was 13, you understand, and Edward was 19, and I thought he was a cheeky sort. He had just joined the Grand Army of the Republic to fight for the Union in the Civil War, and before he left, he said to me, "Tilly, you watch our land until I come home." Well, I thought that took a lot of nerve if he thought I was going to wait for him, and I said to my mother, I wouldn't marry Edward Miner if he was the last man on earth. Well, he came back in 1865, whole and healthy. I was teaching by that time at Bassford School. Now, in those days, you didn't have to go to college to be a teacher. You just had to go to school a little bit yourself and prove that you knew a few things, and then you could teach. And I lived with the students that I taught. That wasn't a bad idea. You know, you really got a little different slant on the students when you saw where they were living and you got to know their parents. And I lived with different parents throughout the year. Now, Edward had come back, and I was 17, and he started courting me. And it didn't take very long before I realized that I had changed my mind about men in general and about Edward Sloan Miner in particular. And in 1867, we were married. It turned out he wasn't the last man on earth that I would marry. He was the only man on earth that I would ever marry. In the next 4 years, we had 3 children, Stanton, Byron, and Sybil. And in 1875, Edward, being something of an entrepreneur, looked around in Fish Creek and saw that there was a need for a store. And so he opened up a hardware store. Now, we slacked back on the farming a little bit because we needed time to run the hardware store. And we served the community with goods, hardware goods, and other goods. It was more like a general store, really. In 1878, another daughter, Maud, was born. And in that year, Edward was elected to his first office. He was elected to the State Assembly. And he served 3 terms. Now, Edward was off to Madison. And I was left home with children, the hardware store, and the farm. Now, Edward had great confidence in me, and it was well placed because I could handle all those things myself, and he wasn't gone all the time. I'm not saying that he was gone all the time, but I was in charge pretty much. In 1882, we moved to Sturgeon Bay, and we opened a hardware store there, and at that time, Edward was elected to the state senate, and he ended up serving 2 terms there. In 1883, we built our dream house. We bought a whole block in Sturgeon Bay. It was kind of on the outskirts, actually, then. It was on Minor Street. They've changed the name now, you know, to 7th Avenue, which has none of the class that Minor Street had. We had the whole block, and so I could have my cow and my chickens. I understand they don't let you have those in the city anymore, but I had them then. And I had fruit trees and a flower garden and a vegetable garden, and I had this wonderful house. It was a big square white house. When you went in the front door, you went up the stairs like this, a curving balustrade. It was beautiful. Big windows let in lots of light, a wide hallway, big rooms. Now, my father's house is gone, but my house is still there. Do you know what it is? It's the Christian Science Society. And you know, that makes me feel really good because I was a Christian Scientist. And the people there that are using my house share the same beliefs that I had. So I'm feeling really happy about my house, especially since they really haven't changed very much of it. Now in 1885, our daughter Eula was born. She's just buried back over here. And Edward was elected mayor of Sturgeon Bay. In 1888, our last daughter, Ethel, was born. I was 40 years old at the time. And Edward had come home to Sturgeon Bay. He was not off to Madison anymore. But, they started talking to him and they wanted him to run for office again. So in 1894, he ran for office again. He ran for the U.S. House of Representatives. And you know what? He was elected. And we got to go to Washington, D.C. This little pioneer girl from Sturgeon Bay got to go and live in Washington, D.C. We even bought a house there. We kept the house here, but we bought a house there on D Street. And we were there for 12 years. It was a grand time. I got to mix with all the famous people, all the representatives' wives, all the husbands, senators. It was just an exciting time. We came back here in 1906 and settled down for a while, but in 1918, Edward was persuaded to run for office again. He was persuaded to run for mayor. Now, in 1918, you understand, most of the men were gone. They were off there fighting in the Great War, the war you now call World War I. And so Edward had the experience, and he was elected. Now, personally, I thought, this is the time to elect a woman. But it didn't happen. Hasn't happened since, is my understanding. Never been a woman mayor of Sturgeon Bay. Something to think about. 1924. That was the saddest year of my life. My Edward took sick. My husband of 57 years took sick and died. And he was gone. And he's buried here. The funeral cortege that brought him here was miles long. The flags were at half-staff. It was such a wonderful ceremony. No one had seen anything like it. And he deserved it. He was a wonderful man. He was a wonderful husband, a wonderful father. And he served his state well. The funeral service that he had was just perfect. I can't say that I remember all of it, but I know it was a grand affair. And so I was left alone in the house, in my house. But, I had a lot of interests. I had a lot of interests outside of my husband and outside of my children. I had a lot of interests of my own. I like to read a lot, and not just Christian Science books. I like to do a wide variety of reading on a wide variety of subjects. I knit. I painted china. Now that was very popular back then. I understand it isn't popular today, but I painted lots of china. Almost all my descendants have it. I made quilts for everyone in the family, and my stuffed baked late trout was known county-wide. It was delicious. So I kept busy with the children and the grandchildren, but in 1933 I think I got my father's itchy feet, and I thought, well, I'm going to go see a little more of the world, and I'm going to go out to the West Coast, out to Portland, Oregon. My daughter Maud was living out there, and I thought I would visit her, and I thought perhaps I could see some of the Graham relatives. Now, my father, the one of the itchy feet, he had gone out there in 1875, shortly after I was married, and taken the whole family with him, so I hadn't seen some of these people for almost 50 years. And I was so looking forward to a reunion and to seeing my daughter Maud. Well, I got out there, and I got the flu. And the flu went into pneumonia. And it was 1933, and I was 84 years old, and I died. And my daughter Maud, she brought me back here, and I'm buried there next to my Edward. I didn't have as grand a funeral as Edward had, but the Christian Science Society and the Eastern Star did me proud. Now, the next time that you folks are driving through Sturgeon Bay and you go past the Peterson Pool, you look for that little stone with that plaque on it, and you think about the little pioneer girl that lived in that house when there were no other houses. And when you drive on 7th Avenue past the Christian Science Society, I want you to think of Tilly Miner with a smile.
Hello, my name is Iola Salway. I was born March 5th, 1887 to Hugh and Ida Salway, who immigrated here from Norway in the mid-1850s. Mother and father built a small log cabin, about 1.5 miles down the road on the shores of Green Bay. It was a small cabin, consisted of 4 rooms, 3 rooms on the bottom floor and a large loft on the top floor. I was the 4th of 8 children. We children took over the top floor and used that as our sleeping rooms. We received our formal education at the Cherry School. After that, I graduated from a local high school. I went back to work for Mom and Dad, but I wasn't satisfied with this. I wanted to do more with my life. I always had enjoyed taking care of people, so I decided to enter nursing school. At the age of 26, I entered Bellin School of Nursing. This was in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and that was quite a distance for me to travel. I don't know if you're aware, but in those days, Bellin School of Nursing, or any school of nursing for that matter, were 3-year schools. You went to school all year round. You not only received a formal education, you also were a large part of the nursing staff there. We worked very hard. I saw many things, lots of illnesses which can be cured now, and a lot of accidents, farm and industrial accidents. I completed my formal training in 1918 and returned to Sturgeon Bay to begin my career. I started my career at the Eglin Hospital, which is now known as the Dorchester. Apparently, about in 1914, Dr. Eglin had taken a private residence and converted it into a hospital. This burned in 1920, and he built the Eglin Hospital. It was a beautiful building. Large stone building, big trees and a large sweeping driveway. Many of the doctors that you're probably familiar with were on staff there. There was Dr. Hirschbeck and Dr. Mulhauser, Dr. Dorchester, Dr. Hoff, and of course Dr. Leesom and Dr. Eglin. Everything was fine till about 1928. And Dr. Leesom and Dr. Eglin got into a disagreement on how to take care of patients. So Dr. Leesom decided that he would open his own hospital. He scoured the county or the town for a building and decided on the Pinney Building, which you will know as the Fairfield Gallery. Along with the hospital also was a phone company, a photography building, and numerous other offices. I was very proud that he asked me to be the head nurse there. And we equipped our hospital largely with furniture and equipment from People's Hospital, which was where Dr. Tamayo's house is now. You entered our hospital through the side entrance, the same way you enter the Fairfield Gallery. You walk up a flight of stairs, and it would open up into a large lobby. Off of this lobby radiated patient rooms. There was a male ward, a female ward, some private rooms that could be turned into semi-private, and a capacity for 5 newborns. All in all, our census was about 14. Also radiating off of this lobby were 2 large swinging doors that opened up right into the surgery area. I constantly had to tell my nurses to keep these doors closed, as you could see right into surgery. One particularly sad event occurred when one of our surgeons was doing a leg amputation on a young man, and the doors were slightly ajar. The parents were out in the lobby and heard the surgery going on. It also doubled as a delivery room. It was not anything to have me come in the morning and see a nervous young father pacing away in the lobby while his wife was in delivering. We worked very hard in those days. We not only took care of patients, we also did a lot of housekeeping duties. Cleaned thermometers, took rubber gloves, checked them for holes, repowdered them and re-sterilized them, sharpened needles. Also did one particular thing that I wasn't real fond of, but we would clean the red rubber catheters that were reused for douches and enemas. We also repackaged and sterilized all the drapes. Dr. Leesom's wife was very gracious in the fact that she would take the linen home and do them at home and then bring them back, and we would have to package them. I was a fanatic about sterilization, as infection was still a #1 killer in the county, as it was before the advent of penicillin and any other antibiotics. It gave me a great deal of pleasure to have someone come in with a bad leg infection, and with good nursing care, that person went home. We got to know our patients very well, as most of them stayed for about 10 days, regardless of what they came in with. And most of the time they were on bed rest. When they did get up, they were quite weak. We had to help them and also remind them to cough and deep breathe, as pneumonia also was a killer. I don't know if you're aware, but we lived in the same building as the hospital was on. The hospital had the 2nd floor, and we had the 3rd floor. This wasn't all bad. If a mother would deliver a baby we were particularly concerned about, we would put the baby in the bassinet, bring it up to our room, and watch him there for the night and report any changes to the doctor. Also on this floor was the kitchen. Made meals for the patients, brought them down by dumbwaiters, and also made meals for us. Part of our salary was room and board. We weren't paid much in those days. Of course, any wage was a welcome wage, as we had just gone through the Great Depression. In fact, I remember in 1929, Dr. Leeson came to us and said, "I'm sorry, ladies, I have no money to pay your wages, and you are free to leave and seek work elsewhere." I'm happy to say not one of us left. We loved Dr. Leeson, who truly was a great man. And we were all saddened when he had to leave us and join the armed forces in the beginning of World War II. We learned he was stationed in the Philippines, and we read religiously everything that came in the newspapers about the Philippines. We paid particular attention to one thing called the Bataan Death March. This was where the Japanese captured a lot of our young men and marched them the length of the peninsula, 55 miles, starving them, torturing them, and many of them were killed on the way. We prayed this wasn't where Dr. Leeson was, and his wife and daughter Tiz knew in their hearts that he was all right. It turned out, yes, he was in the Bataan Death March, but he did come home, a much weaker man, however, and never could resume his practice. We did fun things too, though. Our doctors would call us in the middle of the night, and off we would go with them to far reaches of the county, helping deliver babies. It was a happy event. The Leeson Hospital closed its doors in about the late 1940s. And I resumed my career where I started off, at the Eglin Hospital, which at this time was called Door County Memorial Hospital. I worked there a number of years, moved back and lived with my brother and sister, but I was getting weaker and weaker. I wasn't sure why. Till about the mid-1950s, I was diagnosed as having Lou Gehrig's disease. I became so weak that I could no longer stay at home, so I was admitted to Door County Memorial Hospital, the very place that my career started and ended. I died at the age of 66, and Stevenson Funeral Home handled the arrangements. I was interred here at Bayside. I understand Earl Mitch LaPlante dedicated a portion of his radio program to me, calling me an angel of mercy, dedicated to the care of the sick and bedridden of the county. I truly appreciated this, but I was doing no more or no less than any of the nurses of my day or the nurses do now. I would like to add as a postscript, I too am a nurse with 32 years of nursing experience, and I was truly honored to be asked to portray Iola Sawe, who was truly a pioneer of nursing in the county. Thank you.
Goodbye. How do you say goodbye when you really don't want to go? How do you say goodbye to people you have enjoyed so? The way to say goodbye is not to say goodbye at all. Just a wave of the hand with a smile that says, I've had a ball. For you never really go, and you never are far apart from those you hold in your memories, from those with a place in your heart. Ed Halloran, City Editor, Cincinnati Times Post-Dispatch.